Hello, Netrunner fans, and welcome to my review of Quorum. This is the sixth and final data pack in the Flashpoint cycle. In part 1 of this video, we're going to be looking at all the runner cards. Part 2, we'll look at all the Corp cards. First up, we have a new console for Anarchs. This is Cypher. It's 5 to install, it's 1 influence, it's unique, it's a hardware console. Gives you plus 2 MU. Once per turn, when you encounter a piece of ice, you may reduce your maximum hand size by 1 until the beginning of your next turn. If you do, the strength of that ice is lowered to 0 for the remainder of the encounter, and it's limit 1 console per player. Well, if you've read any forums, you've seen the sky is falling sort of response to this card. And if you've watched my reviews for a long time, you know that I generally don't buy into that kind of hype. But for this card, it seems very different to me, and I am buying into the hype. First of all, let's go through some of the basic things you can do with this card. Like with Security Nexus, this is going to give you a once per turn ability to essentially invalidate a piece of ice. Now, you're going to still have to have a breaker, but it's going to be a lot easier to break ice if the strength is 0, especially if you're looking at some of the biggest, highest end ice in the game. But this has a ton of advantages over Security Nexus. It's only 5 to install. It's not going to eat up all of your influence outside of a Sunny deck. It's only 1 influence. And the icing on the cake, it's going to give you the full 2 MU instead of just 1 from Security Nexus. And this requires quite a bit less setup. Usually with Security Nexus, you're going to want to play link cards or something that's going to make it easier for you to win that trace. With this, you basically just need an icebreaker, and it's not like Anarch has any shortage of good icebreakers. Now, on top of that, you have the interaction with Parasite. Parasite was already really strong, especially with Clone Chip and SMC to tutor it up during a run. This is going to be a way to essentially destroy any piece of ice with a Parasite. And it's already going to be an in-faction thing for Anarchs. It's pretty easy to play in Shaper. You could play 2 of this, and then you have just maybe 1 or 2 Parasites that you can use over and over. Some listeners are going to be quick to point out that we have Lotus Field or Architect as something that can't just be destroyed with this combo. But both of those are pretty easily broken with cards that you're already going to play in a deck that might use this. So like Faust could beat it, you could use Atman or something like that to beat it out of Shaper. So it doesn't seem all that difficult to beat those cards in the decks that you're going to play this one. It's also tempting to suggest ice that have tons of subs, so like Kamainu or Tour Guide, or maybe even Brainstorm. But these are all inherently pretty low strength to begin with, so they're already pretty weak to Parasite, and as long as you have a way to install that Parasite during the run, there's not a whole lot that you have to worry about. One thing we've yet to talk about is the downside to this card. You have to reduce your maximum hand size by 1 to the beginning of your next turn. That's just really not a very big deal. It's going to make you more vulnerable to like Scorched Earth or maybe other flatline tools like Ronin, but you've already got I've Had Worse as a pretty good solution to that, and there's plenty of other ways to ablate the damage if that was really a big concern. This seems like a pretty trivial downside, and especially for such a powerful effect, you're really just not going to care about reducing your hand size. I have to admit that I'm pretty disappointed with this card. I've always felt like the core problem with Parasite was the cards that enabled Parasite, so like Clone Chip and SMC and Data Sucker, that sort of thing. If you just had to play a Parasite and let it sit there and build up counters, the Corp could purge during that time, I don't really think that'd be a big deal. But we saw Parasite being a really big issue with the game, just destroying everything. And that's why the Most Wanted list addressed this problem, and I think was reasonably effective at dealing with the Parasite issue. Now with this, it's hard to say what's going to happen. This is definitely going to resurrect the Parasite spam sort of thing, and even without Parasite, this is still a really powerful tool to just run over some of the biggest, glacieriest ice in the game. Next up is a new icebreaker for Anarch. This is Suniya. It's 3 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 3 influence. It's an icebreaker killer, and it starts with 1 strength. When an encounter in which you use Suniya to break all the subroutines on that piece of ice ends, place 1 power counter on it. It gets +1 strength for each power counter on it, and then it has 2 credits, break Century subroutine. I can't think of a better example of the schizophrenic nature of this cycle than this card being right after the card we just looked at. 2 credits per subroutine has pretty much never worked, and the only way you'd even be able to justify that is if you were running into centuries where the strength was the main issue. Now, there's already tons of ways to invalidate strength within Anarch, especially the card we just looked at. But on top of that, you've always had Data Sucker, Null can do it. There's plenty of ways to get around the strength problem. So something like this, where its core advantage is that it's going to retain this strength over time, is not going to be worth it if you have to pay 2 credits per subroutine. There's already plenty of better ways to deal with centuries than this, and I don't anticipate this seeing any play. Next up, we have a new piece of hardware for Criminal. This is Recon Drone. It's 1 to play, it's 3 influence. It has X credits, trash, prevent X damage from a card currently being accessed. This is a pretty specialized card that's only going to work against a small subset of effects, but it's going to be pretty good against those. So advanceable traps like Junebug or Cerebral Overrider, this is going to be able to deal with. It's also going to help against Snare, Fetal AI, stuff that you normally see in Jinteki damage decks. But that's pretty much all this is going to do. So I think unless the metagame shifts so that you're really worried about stuff getting Mushin Notioned all the time, or there just being a lot of advanceable stuff, I don't really see this being good enough. I could maybe see it be worth including in a deck that already has the win trash sort of tech trader Geist kind of economy. Because if you're already doing that, this is going to be something where it's going to be a lot easier to get value out of it than you would just preventing the damage from something in a more standard deck. But that's really specialized, and I don't think the metagame's really there right now, so I'm not anticipating this seeing a ton of play. Next up is a new criminal program. This is Tapeworm. It's 0 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 2 influence. It's a virus. Install only if you've made a successful run on a central server this turn. When your turn begins, gain 1 for every 5 credits in the Corp's credit pool. Trash Tapeworm if the Corp purges virus counters. Here's a pretty cool little drip economy tool for Criminal, and I definitely think this is good enough to see some play. It's totally reasonable that the Corp would have 10, maybe even 15, 20 credits, especially later in a game. And the fact that you just have to make a successful run on any central, including archives, that's going to make it really easy to install this thing. This is going to be really, really good at getting you caught up with a Corp that's way ahead in the credit war. And the fact that you could have multiples of this installed only makes it more powerful. I think a lot of times it's going to be a bad proposition for the Corp to purge this, so they're almost certainly going to have a card effect in order to purge this, like Cyberdeck's Virus Suite. This is a pretty clever design. I like the way that this incentivizes the Corp purging without being something that snowballs and piles up counters like Medium. And I'm hoping that we'll see more cards like this in terms of virus design. Next up is another program for Criminal. This is Tracker. It's 0 to install, 2 MU, it's 2 influence. When your turn begins, choose a server, then it has click, 2 credits, make a run on the chosen server. Prevent the first subroutine that would resolve this run from resolving. This card is essential Criminal to me. They've always had ways to get past ice in tricky ways, kind of the inside job sort of card. This potentially lets you use it multiple times on the chosen server, and it's going to run over a 1 subroutine piece of ice, assuming you can break ice in front of it. This could be pretty nice at dealing with some of the downsides of your own icebreakers. Like, for example, if you're using Black Orchestra, maybe you have a third subroutine you need to break. You could just let that resolve, and this will prevent it from resolving. That's pretty cool. You could make a similar argument about something like Grappling Hook, or also potentially the central-only breakers. It's also going to make it easier to run if you're worried about face-checking some horrible piece of ice. This will potentially save you from some of the bad ones if the first subroutine is the thing you're scared of. All that said, this card has some pretty obvious downsides. 2MU is a massive problem. Most criminal rigs don't have enough extra MU for this, and if you had the MU, you would rather play like Medium or Data Sucker, something like that in those slots. It's going to be pretty hard to fit a 2MU program into a lot of standard rigs. And when you add in that the best console for criminal only gives you 1MU, I think that makes it really challenging to use this. This definitely seems like it'd be better if you were playing a more alternative rig, not just the standard credits for breaking kind of rig. Next up, we have a resource connection for criminals. This is Aaron Marone. He's 2 to play, he's unique, he's 2 influence. Whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, place 2 power counters on him, hosted power counter, remove 1 tag, and draw 1 card. This guy is absolutely bonkers. This is easily, hands down, the best anti-tag card we've ever seen, and I think it even has utility outside of that. First of all, this is a hard counter to breaking news, which is the best tag effect in Netrunner. This is just going to give you to the 2 counters when they score it, and then you could instantly ditch those tags so that they couldn't hit you with boom or exchange of information or scorched earth, any of that kind of stuff. This is also a really powerful early game tool against hard-hitting news or mid-season, just going to take a lot of teeth out of those effects. On top of that, this has some really good synergy with existing criminal cards. You can tutor it with hostage, it works well with all of the connection-oriented stuff, but also there's a lot of cards in criminal that give you tags, especially account siphon. This is going to be a way to deal with the drawback of account siphon, and you get to draw cards, and it takes no clicks to do this. The other thing this does that's maybe not quite as obvious is it lets you draw cards clicklessly. So you're going to be able to draw cards on the Corp's turn. That is really, really powerful against flatline decks, especially Jinteki. PE is going to have a lot of trouble with this. IG decks that are killing you with like Bioethics Ronin are going to have a lot of trouble with a card like this. Argus Security is just massively invalidated by this tool. And even if you're up against, say, a Glacier matchup that has none of these tags or flatline things, just doesn't care about that at all, this is still going to be a way that you're going to draw some cards for free. That's really good. And this is a good enough economic tool, even if it wasn't really strong against a lot of the stuff we just talked about. Next up, we have an event for Shaper. This is Encore. It's 0 to play, it's 4 influence. Play only if you made a successful run on R&D HQ and Archives this turn. Take an additional turn after this one. Remove Encore from the game instead of trashing it. Time Walk effects are good, so the power level of this card is certainly not the problem, right? Take an extra turn, that's really good. Not only do you get the clicks that you would have during that turn, but all your beginning of turn effects would trigger. So your Beth, for example, is going to trigger at the beginning of that additional turn. But making these 3 runs is expensive and could potentially be a waste of some clicks if you don't have a reason to run, say, Archives. On top of that, we've already got some really good things to do with these 3 central server runs. Notoriety is great for fixing the 6-point problem, and Apocalypse is certainly a more powerful card than this, even if it is kind of hard to play with a Shaper Big Rig. I could maybe see this seeing some play in a deck that's playing like DDoS siphon kind of stuff, because you're already going to have some good synergy with the DDoS with this card. That could maybe make this a little bit more permissible since you wouldn't have to spend as much to make those central server runs. But generally, my reaction is it's going to cost you more than the benefit of this to make those 3 runs. And this effect, while cool, I think is more that than it is good. Next up, we have a new icebreaker for Shaper. This is Fox. It's 5 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 2 influence. It's an icebreaker killer, and it starts with 1 strength. It has credit, break sentry subroutine. Then it has X credits plus X strength for the remainder of this run. Use this ability only by spending at least 1 credit from a stealth card. Stealth has been getting a lot of new tools lately. This is the 3rd in a cycle of icebreakers, and it's pretty clearly the worst. This, first of all, doesn't compare all that favorably to Dagger, which is an in-faction alternative to this. Not only is Dagger cheaper to install, but it's better at getting a ton of strength, which sometimes matters against sentries. And if you just wanted an insanely good way to run over all sentries with a stealth icebreaker, Switchblade is a much, much better option there. The only advantage this has over the other 2 breakers I mentioned is that it has persistent strength. So if you run into a multiple sentry server, this could potentially save you a few credits not having to boost strength. That's definitely possible. In fact, it's even likely against certain Glacier builds. But is it going to be worth including this in your deck for that reason? I think most of the time the answer to that is going to be pretty clearly no. So I don't really think this is going to see a ton of play. The final runner card in the pack is a neutral event. It's called Peace in Our Time. It's 1 to play, it's 1 influence, it's priority. Play only as your first click, and only if the Corp scored no agendas during his or her last turn. Gain 10 credits. The Corp gains 5 credits. You cannot initiate any runs this turn. This is a pretty sweet economic tool that is going to require the right kind of deck. Since it's going to prevent you from running and it gives the Corp money, that's a pretty serious drawback that's going to keep it out of a lot of decks. But if you're playing a deck that has a lot of setup or wants to do all of its runs in one explosive turn, this is potentially pretty good. The first place my mind went with this was the Keyhole Shaper decks, the ones that use DDoS and False Echo and things that give them clicks like Hyperdriver to just set up for these explosive turns where you run and mill a ton of cards with Keyhole. And those decks aren't going to care about playing this early in the game because they're not really able to make a lot of runs. Their icebreaker setups are usually terrible or even non-existent. So it's not going to really matter to you that you're not able to make runs early in the game when you play this, but it is going to give you the credits you need to set up all your stuff. I could also see this being more permissible if we see more cards like Beth or like the Tapeworm that we just looked at. Cards where the Corp having a ton of credits is somehow a benefit to you. This card becomes a lot more permissible, giving them 5 if you have some way to capitalize on that. That's going to do it for part 1 of my Quorum review. Be sure to tune into part 2. We have a lot of Corp cards to look at over there, some pretty neat stuff. And give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment and let me know what I'm right or wrong about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over in part 2.